I'm Royce Walker, and tonight I'm very pleased to welcome and introduce Dan Conlin, our guest speaker. He's going to present his talk about many of the wrecks near McNabs Island. Dan is a historian, author, and retired museum curator in Halifax, originally from Berwick, Nova Scotia. Dan studied journalism and history at Carleton University in Ottawa, and then worked as a producer for CBC Radio in Ontario. He returned to Nova Scotia to pursue a master's in history at St. Mary's University, and one of his first steps in reconnecting with the province was to join the Friends of McNabs Island Society. And shortly after, he helped by writing the chapter Navigation and Shipwrecks in the Friends Guidebook, Discover McNabs Island, which I'm sure everybody has their copy in their pocket there tonight. Dan served as curator at the Maritime Museum of the Atlantic for 19 years, where he was responsible for many successful exhibits, including the Titanic display. He also curated for a pirates exhibit, which led to his first book, Pirates of the Atlantic, Robbery, Murder, and Mayhem off Canada's East Coast. His second book, War Through the Lens, the Canadian Army Film and Photo Unit, was based on personal interviews and research Dan conducted for his undergraduate thesis. From 2014 until his retirement in November 2024, Dan was curator at the Canadian Museum of Immigration at Pier 21. His last show at Pier 21 was A History Exposed, the first national exhibition of the history of slavery in Canada, including a profile of the McNabs Island merchant and slaveholder, Joshua Major. Please join me in welcoming Dan to our talk tonight. Dan?
Thank you very much, Royce, and it's an honor to be doing the talk for the 35th anniversary of the Friends of McNabs Island. Everybody hear me okay? Okay, good. For this talk, I'm going to be looking at the shipwrecks on the coves and the coasts and the water adjacent to McNabs Island. And McNabs is a real tremendously valuable heritage resource. It has scores of shipwrecks from every period of Halifax's history. And they're a real amazing little time capsule of the lives of people in our port. And many of them you can actually still see, which makes McNabs a really impressive place to visit. And it's so good that it's preserved to preserve those heritage resources. So tonight I'm going to introduce you to the shipwrecks of McNabs Island. I'm not going to do all of them, or it'd be a 3-hour talk. But I've got to sort of look at this selected stories of the wrecks around the island. And I'm going to do it sort of in what I call a virtual beach walk around the island and back through time. So we're going to circle the island clockwise and sort of look at the wrecks along the waters as we go, and their stories. And there's some powerful sad stories, a couple of some funny stories, and there's some interesting mysteries. So I hope you'll kind of enjoy this look at the maritime archaeological resources that surround McNabs Island. So here's a view of our beloved island, and I'm building on work. I got a heritage resource permit in the early 2000s to actually sort of beach walk the island and record visible shipwrecks and match them with the historical record. And so I, over several weeks, I kind of walked the entire shoreline with the late Jim Simpson, who was a passionate hiker and a researcher. And he and I made notes of every visible wreck we could find, and then I compared it to the historical record. And so I'll be drawing on that tonight. This is a little kind of, I annotated the Friends of McNabs map of the island to sort of map out visible shipwrecks, which you can see there, 1 to 27 visible wrecks around the island. We'll be sort of visiting those as we explore. I'm going to start at Major's Beach, that distinctive point in the middle of the island, and then we'll work our way clockwise around the island. Now, as I mentioned, McNabs has tons of wrecks, and it's very much a location issue. The island is right at the entrance to the harbor, so ships that get into trouble coming into Halifax Harbor often end up sinking beside McNabs. So those are your classic accidental shipwrecks. But the other thing is McNabs also has these little coves, which is a great place to dump old ships. So it has wrecks that were sort of discarded ships as well, and hence the preponderance of wrecks around the island. So as I've said, I'm going to begin with McNabs Major's Beach, or Dead Man's Beach, as it's also known, which sticks out from the island. There's Point Pleasant Park and the city in the back. And because it's a bit of a choke point to the entrance to the harbor, there's been a lot of wrecks associated with Major's Beach. And I'll kind of touch on a few of them, like the early 18th century references to ships going to pieces on Major's Beach. And a couple of big 19th century ones, one that was carrying onions and covered the harbor in the 1830s with floating onions after it was wrecked at Major's Beach. Also, kind of a humorous one in 1872, a big Norwegian sailing ship was tacking into the harbor going zigzag, and just as they got to the beach, they weren't able to come about in time, and they crashed right into the beach. All their sails set, but they were so close to the beach, they basically just walked to the end of the bowsprit and jumped onto the beach, and they all got off. And for years, this bark was called the Tordum Scorum. The lighthouse keepers had the name board of that Norwegian bark that sank there. This area, a real concentration of shipwrecks from the very beginnings of the settlement of Halifax. Here's a view of Major's Beach, looking across to the York Redoubt and Ferguson's Cove on the other side. You can see it was the site of a Martello Tower and the lighthouse keeper's residence and a foghorn. There used to be a whole pile of buildings out on the end of Major's Beach. And we've got a big three-masted schooner coming in. You can see how close it is to the beach. And so you get a sense of if you make a navigational error, you'll be piling onto those rocks. Many stories of wrecks associated with the Major's Beach Point. One of the most interesting ones is associated with this with the anti-submarine nets. This is a beautiful color image. I just love it. Taken about 1942, and it's a genuine color image. There wasn't a ton of color photography of Halifax in World War II, but Alan Ruffman, the late Alan Ruffman, put me onto this photo. And this was the double line of steel nets that were designed to keep German submarines from sneaking into Halifax Harbor or firing their torpedoes through. So they ran all the way from basically the foot of York Redoubt to the Major's Beach Lighthouse. And then in the center, there was a big gate. And you can see the gate is open here because this Swedish steamship has just left. And once it's clear, then the winch on the green ship would then, called the gate vessel, would then pull the gate shut and the harbor would be then protected. Contrary to any legendary rumors you ever might have heard, no German sub ever snuck in through the net. It was a very successful defense mechanism. It was a big deal, though, for the thousands of ships that came into Halifax during the war. This gate had to be opened and closed every time for them, which caused a number of different mishaps. I'm going to relate kind of one of them that produced a shipwreck. So great image here. There's so much cool stuff you could say, but I'm going to focus on the one of the gate ships. You see the one on the port side coming in painted red, and then starboard side coming in is painted green, just like ship's lights. And these were tended to be old Navy patrol ships that they retired to operate as sort of steam winch ships to open and close this gates. And one of them, the green one, HMCS Ypres, was an old steel patrol trawler, and she was operating the gates in May of 1940 when a big British battleship, HMS Revenge, came in. You're doing the slides? Okay, yeah, here's HMCS Ypres. So it was an old patrol ship that then was sort of permanently anchored and painted green, and it would open and close the gates when ships arrived. So Ypres was on duty on May the 12th, 1940, when a big British battleship, HMS Revenge, entered the harbor. And so HMS Revenge was this huge battle wagon built in World War I, really powerful first-class battleship, made many visits to Halifax, escorting convoys and also bringing hundreds of thousands of pounds of gold bullion into Halifax as the Bank of England evacuated their currency reserve to the safety of the Bank of Canada during the war. And Revenge was into Halifax all the time, secretly carrying gold. But on May the 12th, 1940, she was coming to the harbor, visibility was poor, and whoever was at the helm got sloppy, and they crashed into the gate ship, HMCS Ypres, which then very quickly was ripped open by this enormous battleship, and Ypres sank right at the gates. Everybody got off safely. The Canadian Navy then found another old patrol ship to replace HMCS Ypres, and it was regarded somewhat humorously. So for the rest of the war, every time HMS Revenge came into Halifax Harbor, the crews of the gate vessels would sort of go to sort of emergency alert, and they would all put their life jackets on and line up on the deck and kind of making fun of this careless British battleship. So Ypres was kind of one of the wrecks right off the tip of Major's Beach. Okay, and next, so we're going to move from Major's Beach, and I'm going to sort of go around to the tip of Ives Point. This is an area, sort of the inner part of the harbor is up here, sort of facing George's Island. And the area just off Ives Point is a very convenient anchorage. If you're a ship just coming to Halifax Harbor, it's a nice sheltered, easy place to get to, and you can drop anchor there until daylight or until your wharf is ready. And so it's a very convenient anchorage for ships to wait. It's also a fairly dangerous anchorage, though, because you're really close to the main traffic of ships coming in and out. And there have been a number of ships that were run down and sunk just north of McNabs Island off of Ives Point. I'll kind of look at a few of those wrecks because there's some really well-preserved wrecks in deeper water off of Ives Point, which are associated with, we're very close to the island. And one of them is the SS Havana. The SS Havana, really significant vessel. This was an early steamship built in Nova Scotia in 1891. The Churchill yards in Hantsport were keen to make the transition from building big wooden sailing ships to try to get into the new era of steamships. So they built this medium-sized steamship. Part of that transition that never really happened with most shipyards in Halifax and Nova Scotia to move it from sail to steam, but the Churchills were trying it. So really interesting. You can see the lines of a sailing ship hull, but it's got the newfangled steam technology aboard. In 1906, Havana had been purchased by a famous Halifax sea captain and diver, Captain James Farquhar. If you've ever been to the Maritime Museum of the Atlantic, they have this great marble statue of a sea captain. That was James Farquhar, Lucky Farquhar, famous for his daring salvage recoveries. And he was anchored off of Ives Point aboard Havana the night of May the 22nd, 1906, because he was salvaging a shipwreck. The Boer schooner Alexander R. had been anchored there, and she had been run down by a Nova Scotia coastal steamer, the SS Strathcona. And so Farquhar was salvaging this sunken schooner when his ship was rammed and sunk in the middle of the night, and the Havana then sank almost right on top of the Alexander R., the ship that she was actually salvaging. Now, fortunately, Captain Farquhar and all his crew got off safely. All his diving equipment and his prize chronometer, etc., went down with the ship. And Havana's wreckage still lies in the bottom of Halifax Harbor. Next slides, please. Quite a significant kind of depression here. Not so much left of the Alexander R., which was a little coastal schooner. But there's been some avocational underwater archaeology of her wreck, and Farquhar's sextant was actually recovered from the wreck. Her remains, quite intact, are still just off of Ives Point. Fortunately, in this case, everybody survived. Not so lucky were the crew of Gertrude da Costa, which was a fishing schooner, and in 1950. Gertrude da Costa, you can see kind of a small to medium-sized fishing schooner. She was anchored off of Ives Point, and a big steamship, the SS Island Connector, was coming to harbor and crashed into Gertrude da Costa at night. And this time, the quick sinking was tragic. There were the captain and 10 crew members aboard Gertrude da Costa perished in the sinking, and there were just 6 survivors rescued. So her wreck is still lying quite close to where Havana is, kind of because of that exposed anchorage that's very close to Ives Point. Now, also at Ives Point is this really interesting big steel anchor. Which is on the beach, and this is not from a shipwreck, but it has a very interesting marine archaeology connection. And when I was at the Maritime Museum, a fellow named David Trenbith noticed this anchor was emerging out of the beach at the end of Ives Point. And we had a look at its position, and it was one end of the World War I anti-submarine net. So in World War II, the anti-submarine net was way out by York Redoubt and Majors Beach. In World War I, it went from basically Pier 21 over to Ives Point. And it was connected to Ives Point by a series of anchors, and then one big concrete block on the point. And what we think this anchor that you could see eroding in 2004 is one of those anchors that once held the World War I anti-submarine nets. And if you know Halifax history, these submarine nets play a big role in the sad Halifax explosion in 2017 when the SS Mont Blanc arrived with her cargo of munitions. They had just shut down the nets for the night, and Mont Blanc was not allowed to enter. So she waited for the nets to be open in the morning, and when they were open, Mont Blanc went up the harbor, Emo came out, the two ships collided, and the Halifax explosion occurred. So it's kind of the little-known location of those World War I anti-submarine nets, and that anchor, which David Trenbeth was kind of nice enough to document, is probably still in the foreshore of that beach at Ives Point. Now, around the corner from Ives Point, just, David, you could just back up for a second?
Sorry.
So around the corner from Ives Point is Ives Cove, and that's where we're going to go next because it is really an area of the harbor that is loaded with wrecks. Here's a picture Kathy McCarthy took, and so just in this picture, there's 1, 2, 3 visible wrecks, and there's about a dozen just under the water. Ives Cove has attracted a lot of shipwrecks, and these tend to be the disposal shipwrecks. They're wrecks that old vessels had outlived their usefulness, and so they were just dumped in Ives Cove, sometimes for useful reasons, sometimes just to kind of get rid of them. So I'm going to sort of talk about some of those wrecks. Here's a great aerial photo by archaeologist David Jones. It was just taken last week, actually. This time of the year, the water is nice and clear. And with drones, you can get sort of neat shots. So if you look carefully, there's the wharf that's still there at Ives Cove. And look at all these interesting shapes. And so you're looking at a bunch of shipwrecks here. And these wrecks actually have been fairly well documented. Thanks to an event that happened in the late 80s and early 90s, very important to the Friends of McNab, the city of Halifax was going to basically demolish and level the north end of McNabs Island and build a giant sewage treatment plant. And fortunately, saner heads prevailed, and they found different solutions to the Halifax sewage. But that horrible plan to replace McNabs Island with a sewage treatment plant was a catalyst for a couple of good things. One is that Friends of McNabs was very much founded as sort of in opposition to that and to preserve the island for its wonderful natural and human history and recreational potential. So it helped, the sewage plant helped create the Friends, but it also, because they were going to run giant sewage pipes all through this area, they had to do some archaeology. So they hired the firm Jacques Whitford to document these shipwrecks in Ives Cove, and a fellow named Royce did a really good report of the wrecks in Ives Cove. You can consult at the Nova Scotia Museum or the Maritime Museum of the Atlantic. Next slide, please.
Okay, sorry.
So as you can see, there is a ton of wrecks in Ives Cove. Royce Gaines' work kind of did a really good job of identifying the known and unknown wrecks, and there are a whole bunch of them. And so, using kind of this good archaeological work, and I'd love to see some of this work take place in other parts of the island, we can actually identify those really interesting shapes that you see underwater. So you can see there's 2 barges here. There's a unidentified tug here. You can see the shape of the hull and the tug Keenan here. There's another barge out here, and then there are ruins of 2 previous wharves. And one of the wharfs was built on a really interesting 19th century clinker-built yacht, about 15, 20 feet long. The survey in 1993 kind of looked at these wrecks and explored them with scuba divers and documented them and matched them up with a historical record. I'll sort of visit some of them here. And just a little bit kind of 101 about shipwrecks. This unidentified tug, you can see the outline of a hull, and that's because it was a wooden tug with rock ballast. So you had piles of rock to keep the ship steady down below, and the wood hull disintegrated, but you can still see the outline of the ship. And these ones are barges. They were built of very strong cribwork timbers, and they leave a rectangular pattern, and that's often your indication of a barge. So just out of shot here is the ferry Dennis Davis McNab, and it was a steam ferry that was central to the recreational history of McNabs Island. When they built McNabs, as they had a sort of an amusement park and a dance hall, etc., Davis McNab was the steam tug that would take thousands and thousands of Haligonians out to McNabs. And eventually, when it was worn out, it was kind of sunk in Ives Cove. And unfortunately, there's not too much left of her wreck. 1980s divers went in with explosives to blow it apart and salvage the bronze before we had shipwreck preservation laws in Nova Scotia, so there's not much left of Davis McNab. But we have a number of very substantial remains closer to the wharf. And I'll look at the barges first. So these are the big chunks, and they're hard to miss at low tide in Ives Cove. You'll see these things, and you might just think it's a wharf, but these are actually big World War II wooden barges. And there's a number of them, including some of them that are very visible, a little precarious. I think they ended up knocking down some of the exposed timbers because they were a bit of a safety hazard, but their bases are very substantial. And these were barges that were built in World War II as part of the wartime convoy traffic in and out of Halifax. So you can see them. That's Friends of McNab's photos. Does anybody recognize the fellow who's doing some measurement here? If you do, let me know, because I've used the slide a couple of times. You can see that they were built in World War II out of wood to save steel and metal for the bigger and the military ships. So the barges were built out of wood, very heavy wood construction, though, with massive amounts of fastening. And they were mostly used in Halifax for a specific purpose up in Bedford Basin. There's that famous classic wartime shot of Bedford Basin full of hundreds of ships that are gathering to form convoys to bring supplies over to Europe so that Britain could be defended and so the Nazis could be kicked out of Europe. That was all work that was done in Halifax, and ships from all over the planet gathered here. And they also picked up cargo here, and there was a fleet of barges that were used to shuttle cargo back and forth between the convoy ships and the railway yards at Rockingham. So kind of close up here, you can see all the barges lined up. So these are called lighters. They're sort of transfer barges, and there were lots of them in Halifax during the war. And after the war, you could get them for next to nothing. So people bought them to, use as repair platforms, as docks, and they kind of ended up sort of being dumped all over Halifax Harbor, including quite a few at McNabs Island. So you've got the three at Ives Cove, you've got one on Majors Beach, and I think you've got some scattered on the Eastern Passage side as well. These World War II, they're often called CNR barges because they were usually parked right next to the CR railway yards, right next to Mount St. Vincent. And then one of the tugs that is very visible in Ives Cove is the old SS Keenan. This was a wooden steam tug built in 1907 in Midland, Ontario. And it was built sort of to haul log booms around the Great Lakes, do salvage, and was kind of a mid-sized steam tug. It was sank in a storm in 1909 in Penetanguishing, but then it was raised in 1910. So it sank once before it finally sank at McNabs Island. But it was a steam tug that had a long career. About 1935, it went from the Great Lakes into salt water and shows up in Halifax hauling coal barges into the city. And then in 1939, it was purchased by the J.P. Porter Company. It was kind of a famous, some would say infamous salvage company operated out of Dartmouth. Right under the McDonald Bridge, there's still piles and piles of old hulls. They were notorious for buying sort of clapped out old ships and getting their last few years out of them. And they bought Keenan late at the end of her career. And then they eventually sold her to somebody who on McNabs Island who wanted to protect the little wharf there with a breakwater. And so she was sunk, and her hull gradually disintegrated, but her boiler remained. And you often see this with wooden shipwrecks. If they're a wooden steamship, the hull will eventually disintegrate, but boilers are built super strong, and they will last for a long time. And Keenan's boiler is still there. And at low tide, you kind of can't miss it. It might look like it's a floating mooring buoy, but it's actually an old steam boiler from 1907, surrounded by the wooden remains of her hull. Here's a cool picture, courtesy Royce, of there's Keenan. This is 1942. She'd just been left here as sort of the breakwater for the pier. You can see another tug was pushed in front of her to sort of break the swells so you could get on and off this precarious little pier. And so there she is, sort of newly placed as a breakwater vessel. in 1942. Another shipwreck, a tanker, I'm going to get to in a minute in behind here, but you can see over the years she kind of has gradually disintegrated. But her boiler is still there. As I mentioned, boilers often will last a long time, and are important resources, but are kind of worth safeguarding. In 1992, the Department of Transport, for some reason, decided to start demolishing historic shipwrecks in Nova Scotia as part of environmental cleanup. And this was a boiler down by 3 Fathom Harbour, a really important little coastal steamship, the SS Scotia. And I guess one summer cottage residents complained about the boiler at 3 Fathom Harbour, and the Coast Guard were going to rip it apart. But there was a bit of a protest about that, and they had second thoughts. And so it's, old shipwrecks like this are no longer a source of environmental issues, but they're really important heritage resources. And Royce Walker, to his credit, wrote the Department of Minister of Transport after this episode saying, "What about all the wrecks at McNabs Island?" And the Department of Transport said that the McNabs Island wrecks are off limits, that no cleanups are planned for them, which is good to hear. So I'm going to go from Ives Cove and its many wrecks towards Indian Point. But along the way here is a site of a very tragic shipwreck associated with McNabs Island, the tanker SS Cars. Here's a model of SS Cars. She was launched just before World War II, very modern British tanker. And in 1942, she was part of a convoy that was going to be taking aviation gas and oil across the Atlantic to England, and left it with a convoy from Halifax. However, she lost her convoy in bad weather and then turned around heading back to Halifax, and was just 25 miles from the mouth of the harbor when on February the 22nd, 1942, a German submarine found her. U-96, submarine that inspired the famous book and movie Das Boot. The commander of U-96 spotted this tanker. Tankers are premium targets. It's kind of the wherever depended on petroleum in World War II. The Germans always wanted to take out a tanker, and they hit cars with a tanker with a torpedo that ignited her aviation fuel, which then ignited her oil fuel, and the whole ship broke in half and became a mass of flames. There were 47 people aboard, only one survivor. And the bow broke and sank, but the stern remained afloat and was salvaged and then towed into Halifax. This sort of still smoldering stern of this burnt-out tanker with all the bodies of the engine room crew still aboard was towed into Halifax and then beached near Indian Point on McNabs Island. And there's a picture of her kind of run up on the beach and then was there for several months while they figured out what to do with this wreck. A couple things happened while she was at McNabs Island. One is there was a tanker with still her lifeboat davits on the side, and it was actually used for a movie production in 1943, Corvette K-225, a Hollywood movie about the fight against the German submarines. They filmed their sort of abandoned ship routines on this burnt-out tanker at McNabs Island. And you can still see clips of this show on YouTube. And if you see the sailors abandoning the ship, it's actually a real ship that had really been torpedoed and then was just lying on the beach at Indian Point. And then after it was there for about a year, in wartime, nothing goes to waste. They needed a new engine for another tanker that had been torpedoed but hadn't been sunk, but the engine was damaged. So they took the they took the engine out of cars and put it in another tanker, and then the rest of the ship was scrapped. And when I did my beach walk with Jim Simpson, when we got to Indian Point, we could still see some kind of blobs of oil with sand in them, just about where cars was run aground. And I often wondered if that was from the wreck of cars. Of course, it could have been leakage from the oil refinery as well, but she was eventually scrapped. It may have left some residue. Very kind of grim sight. And a lot of people in Halifax remembered this sort of still smoking and smoldering when she was towed into Halifax after this terrible torpedoing. And you could see her from all over the harbor run up against McNabs Island. So we're going to go around Indian Point now. This part of McNabs faces Eastern Passage, where the Naval Air Base at Shearwater is located. And it has some interesting associations with aviation wrecks. There are two sunken airplanes off the point of Ives Point. A Hudson bomber, a two-engine Hudson bomber that crashed into the water near McNabs in 1944, and a Sea Fury aircraft carrier-based fighter plane, which crashed off of McNabs in 1952 rather. So they crashed very close to McNabs Island. Between the crash, the salvage of the engines, and then souvenir hunting, there's not much left of them. But apparently there's some scraps of aluminum where these two aircraft crashed right off the northern point of McNabs Island. Now, also associated with McNabs is just, John, if you could go back a second. In Timmins Cove here, in the woods in Timmins Cove, there's some really interesting barges that have been pulled up into the trees. And these are really lightweight, diagonally planked barges. And I discovered that they were used to look after float planes and seaplanes at Shearwater. So Shearwater had a lot of amphibious planes that back up one. Back. Yeah. Shearwater had float planes to do anti-submarine patrols in both World War I and World War II, and they had little barges that were used to fuel the aircraft and transfer people aboard because they landed and took off in water. And these lightweight barges in the woods at Timmins Cove were kind of from use with these aircraft. And these are deluxe barges. They're not kind of big clunky ones like the CN barges. They were really kind of smaller barges, but really nicely built. And they're in the woods at Timmins Cove. And then moving further down the harbor, we're going to go from Timmins Cove to Back Cove, or Wreck Cove as it's known, because it's one of the other hot spots for shipwrecks on McNabs Island. And it was a popular place to dump ships for a very specific reason, because of this red line. This red line was the jurisdictional boundary of the National Harbors Board. And if you wanted to sink a ship on this side of the line, by the 1950s and 60s, you had to get a permit and permission. This side of the line, you could do whatever you wanted. So if you had a junky old vessel that you didn't want to pay somebody to scrap, you would just dump it in Back Cove. And it became a real ship's graveyard because of it's sort of close to the harbor, but not too close. And it was the location of a whole ton of ships. This is a neat picture from the Maritime Museum of the Atlantic of Wreck Cove or Back Cove in 1960. And you got kind of one vessel here, another one here, one behind it, and then this beautiful looking tug hull. And there were all kinds of vessels that were brought into Wreck Cove. I'd love to get the identity of this nicely lined old steam tug here. I'll kind of, and these wrecks are still very visible at low tide. Next slide. So here's Joe Fleming took a nice drone shot a couple of years ago, so you can see big hull here, another one here, a couple of barges here, and then this one that goes right up the beach. So tons of wrecks at Back Cove, and eventually it became known as Wreck Cove just because there were so many of them. In fact, it became a bit of a news thing in the 1950s and 60s about all the wrecks that were visible. You could walk on their decks. Which were kind of quite romantic, but people who had yachts and cottages around the area hated them because it was this big, rusty, decaying, rotten hulks in the way. And eventually they convinced the government to kind of dynamite the visible wrecks, but it still left tons of stuff below the water. And I'll kind of mention one of them, Lucia P. Dow, big four-masted schooner. You see her loading barite ore at Walton, Nova Scotia. And she often took bulk cargoes from ports in the Maritimes down to New York ports. Really big a four-masted schooner. In her later years, her masts were cut down and she became a coal barge. And she would be used to haul coal to the old power plant. That's now where Nova Scotia Power's headquarters is. And she became a coal barge until she was kind of still worn out from that trade, that then her hull was eventually abandoned in in Wreck Cove. And here's a great shot in 1960, and you can see, literally, you could still walk the decks of these guys, and still had some of the lovely sailing ship wooden carpentry of them. This is Lucia P. Dow, and this is another big schooner turned coal barge kind of right beside her. There's Lawler's Island, the old quarantine facility in the background. Interestingly, you can still see the water tank and the third-class quarantine quarters over on Lawler's in this photo. But because of complaining cottage owners, they were kind of removed, but there's still tons of them lying in the bottom of the ocean of the harbor now, and that's probably the remnants of one of them at low tide. So I'm going to move to the next wreck on, in Wreck Cove, and that is the Canadian government steamship Brandt. Lovely picture by Kathy McCarthy. This one you can like step right over. Almost at high tide, just the bow shows, but at low tide, almost the whole hull is there. And this was a steel sort of trawler supply ship that was built in 1928 in Sorel, Quebec, and then was owned by the Canadian government for her almost her entire career. And she's a really visible, interesting wreck. This is what Canadian government CGS Brandt looked like. You can see she has kind of the look of a steam trawler. The government found in World War I steam trawlers, in addition to hauling fish, were a great design for patrol, minesweeping duties, and also supply duties. They're very seaworthy, but they could get into small ports and islands. And so the government used them for a whole bunch of stuff in the World War I in the 1920s. Brandt was built specifically for the Canadian Lighthouse Service in 1928 and was used to supply small lighthouses and also position buoys. So she was based for much of her career in Charlottetown. She was really good for the smaller lighthouses around PEI. Was much beloved in Charlottetown. Was there for years. People in PEI were crew members. Every year she would be the flagship of the yacht club races in Charlottetown Harbor. And so she had a really long career from 1928 until 1967. Here you see her towards the end of her career in Dartmouth at the old Coast Guard wharves. You can see all the buoys. In the wintertime, they often lift the buoys when the ice comes in, and these ships would lift the buoys and then put them back out in the springtime. And there she is at the Coast Guard wharf in Dartmouth with the old Dartmouth Marine ships and slips in the background. As I mentioned, long career. In 1967, she was the last coal-burning Canadian government ship. By 67, most ships were switching to oil-burning engines. She was the last coal burner. And when she was finally retired in 67, she was bought by a company in Quebec. They had ideas to use her as a sort of a small St. Lawrence supply ship for some of the small ports in the St. Lawrence, but she was pretty worn out. And by 1970, the Hannian brothers from Quebec were getting letters from the city about, do something about your derelict old steamship. So what did they do? They took her to McNabs Island, and in 1970 hauled her up into Back Cove or Wreck Cove, and then her upper works were kind of scrapped on site. And so as I mentioned, at low tide, you can basically walk the whole bottom of the ship. And you can see here's where the hold was, this is where the engine room compartment was, the stem of the rudder is still at the back, and you've got this great anatomy of a 1920s steamship right there for you to explore as if you're walking on the bottom of the ocean. It's a really cool resource. And there's a great drone shot by David Jones taken a couple of years ago, and you can get a wonderful cross-section of the vessel. It'd be really great to get the plans to CGS Brandt and kind of compare it to the framing and the bulkheads that we can kind of still see on site. To me, this is kind of a really wonderful, heritage resource. As a vessel with a long, significant career, big remnants that people can actually explore and kind of connect with the past in a way that you often can't with shipwrecks. So it's a very evocative wreck. This is tailor-made, a fiberglass fishing boat that somebody that broke her moorings in Eastern Passage and then blew ashore on McNabs. When Jim and I did our beach survey in 2004, she was kind of run up in the sand and is now kind of pounded to bits, but there's still lots of fiberglass where she was. So she had 1980s fiberglass fishing vessel. A reminder that that McNabs has all the layers of history of people in the valley, in the harbor right up until recent times. Now, so tailor-made was right along here. This side of the shore doesn't have tons of shipwrecks, and by the way, if you're ever trying to circumnavigate McNabs Island, it's harder than you think. And this section has really tricky beach cobble. Like all the big rocks move underneath you. It took us a long time to get around that point. But there's still interesting remnants. If you look carefully here, you can still see what mariners call bits or bollards, big, heavy steel fittings that you use to tie lines to. And they were just kind of lying along that shore, possibly from one of those World War II barges. I don't think they're there anymore. I think the lure of that much scrap money got somebody from Eastern Patches to lift them off. But, you know, it's kind of, again, the material culture of wrecks around McNabs. Now I'm sort of going to go around the corner here to this is Big Thrumcap, which is sort of a little kind of island attached to an island. And it faces sort of a sunken sister called Thrumcap Shoals, which is just at the entrance to the harbor here. And Thrumcap Shoals is a real ship killer. It's a shallow patch of the water that's right at the entrance to the harbor. And if you're too far to the east, you pile on this sort of sunken island off of McNabs, and there have been dozens of wrecks there with considerable loss of life. And it's probably the deadliest portion of McNabs Island. I'll look at one wreck in particular there, HMS Tribune, an 18th century shipwreck. A big, beautiful frigate newly acquired by the British in 1797 was coming into Halifax Harbor. They decided not to take a pilot, and the officers aboard decided they would navigate her into the harbor themselves. They were too far to the east. They hit Thrumcap Shoal and November 27th of 1797. And it's one of these horrific things. They ran aground. The ship was still afloat. And they thought, we'll just wait for high tide and we'll get off. What they didn't realize was they had damaged the rudder. And when high tide came off, they discovered they couldn't steer just as a gale blew in. And a whole bunch of boats had rushed out to help them. The Royal Navy Dockyard sent a team out to help them. They rowed all the way from the dockyard out to McNabs Island. According to folklore McNabs, one of the fishermen McNabs also went aboard to help. The captain deemed it too dangerous to take people off, and he was confident he'd be able to sail up to the harbor at high tide. But instead, as soon as the ship floated, they discovered that they were at the mercy of the winds, and the winds were blowing from the east, and she was blown right across the harbor. They could see the smoke from chimneys in Halifax, but they were blown onto the rocks at Herring Cove, and over 200 people died that night when the Tribune sank near Herring Cove. The ship sank with the mast protruding above the water, and people clung to the masts all night long and kind of died one by one until a 13-year-old boy from Herring Cove, Joe Cracker, rowed out and started rescuing people. And he inspired a rescue of the remaining survivors, all 12 of them, of this crew of over 200. So that's probably the deadliest shipwreck associated with McNabs Island, and one of the deadliest wrecks associated with Halifax Harbor. This is from the old Tribune display at the Maritime Museum of the Atlantic. You can see Tribune was coming in here, too close to Thrumcap Shoal, ran aground, and then the wind blew her come night over to wreck at Herring Cove. So we're almost done our tour of McNabs Island. So just a couple of wrecks along the way. This is called Culleton Point here. There's a really interesting little mystery wreck that Jim and I discovered. It's a sizable chunk of a capsized hull. And this is either a big chunk of a small vessel or a small chunk of a big vessel, but it's upside down. You can see these are big frames, and there's a sizable keel, and it's sort of tucked in this sheltered area. Thrumcap Shoal is off in the distance, and we don't know what ship this is. I think it would be a really kind of good project for somebody to analyze the timbers and see if it could come up with an identification or at least a more detailed description of her. She emerges from the kelp beds at low tide in kind of ghostly fashion. You don't see her at high tide, but then at low tide, these kind of rotten timbers kind of emerge of this capsized upside down hull. And that's Jim Simpson kind of walking on her as we did some very, very basic measurements. So we've almost completed our walk around McNabs. I'll kind of mention one little thing. The pond at McNabs Island was once open to the ocean, and it was like a little small craft harbor for very small vessels. And charming little, there's like a sort of a little submerged skiff at one end of the pond. And I mean, this looks pretty humble. You wouldn't call this a shipwreck, but nobody makes commercial wooden skiffs anymore. So this is now part of history. And as an example of sort of small craft, and it's now kind of beached in the inner part of the pond. And that pond, you know, who knows what it also might reveal. There might be early Mi'kmaq canoes or settlement sites, sort of in that sort of very low energy protected sediment heavy area of the pond. So as an example of sort of the archaeological kind of potential that McNabs will continue to have for decades. So yeah, that's my little exploration of McNabs, and it's an island that's rich in marine archaeology and stories that kind of give us glimpses at every period of Halifax Harbor, and also give visitors of McNabs something really kind of tangible to kind of witness and see on their visits to the island, and it's been my pleasure to share those stories with you. And if there's any questions, I sincerely love answering questions about history. If you have questions about the wrecks on McNabs, if you have anything to share about the wrecks that you know or have seen there, I'd also love to hear about it. And thank you very much. And I think I see one hand already there. Yes, young fellow. Yes, the SS England, a big steamship with a lot of immigrants, put into Halifax with cholera victims aboard. And she ran aground, but then the tragedy came when her victims were put in quarantine isolation on McNabs Island, and there were no facilities for them. So they were put on McNabs in tents in bad weather, and many of them died. And the burial sites from the SS England, there's two of them. There's one that's near McNabs Cove, which has a marker, and then they buried a bunch on what's called Little Thrumcap, an island that's now submerged. So that's a good one to mention.
There's a monument in Herring Cove on the waterfront with the names of about 6 sailors who passed away in a collision with probably a boat.
Hebridean?
Yes.
Yeah.
What's the story behind that?
Well, Hebridean was a schooner that was kind of converted to a floating bunkhouse. And they had their sort of at the approaches to the harbor, not that close to McNabs, a bit further out. And the idea was instead of having harbor pilots having to make the trip all the way from downtown Halifax to meet incoming ships, the pilot boats would take them off this floating bunkhouse. Unfortunately, because they were very close to the entrance of the harbor, one night the Hebridean, I think it was in the 50s, was run down and sunk with all the pilots in their bunks down below. And it was a real awful tragedy. So the monument at Herring Cove kind of lists the pilots who died aboard that. So she's kind of not close enough for McNabs to kind of include me in this talk, but is kind of a really bitterly sad story.
By the way, the monument to the Tribune is not too far away from Herring Cove.
Yeah. Yeah, there's quite a touching little monument to the wreck of the of Tribune and Herring Cove, and there are the mass graves in the woods where the bodies were recovered. Yeah. Yes, sir, again.
So, me and my dad go to McNabs a lot, and I noticed that on one of the beaches, you can see like a boiler. The top of it's rusty, but you can see the circular flame.
Okay, would that be at the northern part of the island?
Near the pier.
Okay, that sounds like it's the Ives Cove Pier, which would be the boiler from Keenan, that little wooden tugboat I talked about.
I'm talking about the pier closer to the lighthouse.
Oh, and Garrison, a boiler there.
Yeah.
Kind of in Finley Cove, I think I know what he's talking about.
Okay.
Small one, but
Okay, well, maybe after the talk I'll get you to point it out on a map. And that's the thing about steam boilers. They're built so strongly to withstand steam pressure. They'll often outlast the hulls that they were kind of attached to. Yeah. Okay, Dot?
I did.
Hi.
Do you know of any similar shipwrecks near on Lawler's Island or similarly Devil's Island?
That's a good question. There were wrecks at Devil's. It's a high energy site. Devil's Island, many of you know, it's the little island past Eastern Passage, but it's right out there. It's not a good sheltered place for wreck formation. I'm sure there's some debris fields there, but nothing that's anybody's ever explored. And Devil's Island is so hard to get to. It'd be really hard to document. Lawler's has a few small hulls, but because it wasn't right next to the harbor entrance, it also doesn't have the sheltered cove that McNabs was, it wasn't a favorite place to dump stuff. It does have the really interesting ruins of the old immigration quarantine station on Lawlers, but and I've circled Lawlers a couple times and never noticed any hulls there. Back row?
I was interested in the submarine. For years I've been.
No, please continue. We'll get you.
When you look at the picture of the submarine net, you see that the red ship is on the port side coming in, and the green is on the other side, and yet nowadays red is always on the right coming in. So they must have used the European navigation system in Halifax Harbor at some point. I'm not sure when it turned around the other way.
Yeah, it's a good question. Most of us associate red right returning, but the Navy operation, I've seen the way the Navy did it, probably did that right across the British Empire. So, yeah. And the young fellow at the back? Yeah.
Yeah, thanks. I just wanted to recommend a local television show. It's called
Sorry, David.
No worries. It's called Jump In, and it's available on Eastlink Television. A couple of seasons ago, they did some diving and exploring through the boiler of the tugboat Keenan in Ives, so you can watch that somewhere for free. I'm not a computer guy, despite being under 40 years old. I'm not a computer guy, so I can't really tell you where. But I have seen the episode myself. It's pretty interesting. They go inside the boiler, so you can kind of see it underwater. And there might be some ghost stories in the second half of that Halloween special as well. So anyways, interesting. The TV show is called Jump In.
Okay, thank you for sharing that. Yes, sir.
Were there any submarine wrecks near McNabs?
No submarine wrecks that I know of. The Canadian Navy was never heavily into submarines, but we did have some during World War II that would come and go, and then some training submarines. There's one sunken submarine in St. Margaret's Bay, an old British training submarine, but those are that's the only submarine wrecks that I know. Aside from, there's a German U-boat sunk at the entrance to the harbor, U-190, fascinating, weird story. It was a German submarine, formidable one, that sank a dozen ships, including a Canadian Navy ship. It survived the war, and when they surrendered at the end of the war, it became HMCS U-190, and it was sort of did a kind of a victory tour of Canadian ports. And then in 46 or 47, the Navy decided to sink it as kind of partially a training exercise, but also a weird symbolic revenge. So they painted it in weird pink and yellow stripes and towed it out to the entrance of Halifax Harbor, right where she'd sunk HMCS Esquimalt. And then aircraft and cannon fire then sunk it. And so U-190 is a German submarine. It's sort of at the deep water at the entrance to the harbor. And so those are the only subs. That one and the British sub I mentioned in St. Margaret's Bay, I think it's L-26. You'll hear lots of legends. I think every time somebody finds an old propane tank underwater or something, they say, oh, this is a mysterious German U-boat wreck that was covered up. But those are the only two submarine wrecks I know. Yes, sir, at the back?
Just one more thing. Aside from the German U-boat that's in the Northwest Star that we all know about, do you have an approximate number of shipwrecks inside the harbor and the approaches, just in general, like a general number?
Yeah, it's really tricky given the age of Halifax, the density of the traffic, and often when we're recording shipwrecks, a ship will be recorded as a wreck and then it's salvaged and raised and taken away. So does it still count as a wreck? But to give you a decent answer, I'd probably say associated with Halifax, about 300 wrecks, if you include Halifax Harbor and approaches. The count for the entire province is 10,000. Just because Nova Scotia has, a long coastline with centuries of history and many wrecks. So it's a shame we don't have a provincial underwater archaeologist, because we're one of the most densely packed shipwreck areas in eastern North America. But I'd say probably about 300 associated with Halifax, and they're all over the place. And people often don't realize, that there's a cluster of 5 wrecks right under the Angus L. MacDonald Bridge. That Bedford Basin has dozens of wrecks, so they're kind of all over there. The wonderful thing about McNabs is at low tide you can actually see them. So interesting question.
Dan,
Yes.
someone on Zoom would like you to repeat the books that you have written again.
Oh, yeah. I wrote a history of piracy in Atlantic Canada called Pirates of the Atlantic, Robbery, Murder, and Mayhem on Canada's East Coast. Coming out with the second edition this year of it, where I look at the real history of piracy and then all the myths and do kind of a bit of myth busting in that book. I wrote a second book about World War II photography called A War Through the Lens, about World War II photography. Those, I've got a couple of other projects, but those are the two books I've published so far, in addition to my chapter in the Discover McNabs Island guidebook.
Yeah. Okay, thank you.
And I think our young shipwreck fan has another question.
Does the, I think it was called the SS Atlantic?
Yeah.
One of it was known as the worst ship around before the Titanic. Would that one count as the Halifax?
Well, I included it as a Halifax shipwreck. It's Lower Prospect, so between here and Peggy's Cove, and it was a huge international wreck. And 1873, almost a brand new ship owned by the White Star Line, the same folks who would build Titanic, puts into Halifax for coal. Navigational error, crashes into the rocks at Lower Prospect, and unlike Titanic, which took 2 hours and 40 minutes to sink, the SS Atlantic sank in 5 minutes, and ghastly loss of life. Over 600 people died, and every single woman and child died in that sinking. All the families died. There was one boy who was rescued the next morning, but it was a really kind of grim wreck. There's a wonderful museum in Terrence Bay near Lower Prospect. They have a wonderful Heritage Interpretive Center that tells the story of the SS Atlantic. So prior to Titanic, it was the biggest ocean liner sort of disaster, and the same bloody company that was responsible for Titanic. Prior to the explosion, it was the biggest loss of life in Halifax. So it's too far from McNabs to include in this talk, but it's certainly a really powerful story. And I highly recommend the Interpretive Center in Terrence Bay, which looks at the SS Atlantic, and the mass grave of the victims is a short little walk from the Interpretive Center. And it's a really interesting story that more people should know about.
There's a good little film on that shipwreck as well. Yeah, and I find it very interesting. So it is a very interesting story.
So, money wrecks.
Sorry.
Money wrecks were the plunder, the treasure.
Yes, treasure shipwrecks. In Nova Scotia's long history of 10,000 wrecks, there are a handful of wrecks that had large amounts of gold and silver aboard. Generally, government ships with payroll or associated with invasions to buy money for supplies. And there's a handful of treasure wrecks in Nova Scotia, real ones, like Chameau up near Louisbourg, which had sort of the entire currency for New France was being shipped over for the year, and she sank near Louisbourg. And the wreck was found in the 1960s by treasure hunters. And then a couple of other British invasion ships that had large money to buy supplies. So there's a handful of ships that had treasure aboard. It's created a whole weird industry of treasure hunters in Nova Scotia who are convinced that hundreds and hundreds of ships had large amounts of gold and silver. And more significantly, they managed to sucker investors into giving them large amounts of money to recover the treasure. And so there's a strange industry. It doesn't produce very good archaeology because they just go in after the gold and silver. But there are some wrecks with treasure in Nova Scotia. And then, there were small amounts of gold and silver on kind of most of the big wrecks. I mentioned HMS Tribune, the warship that sank in 1797. She had a small amount of currency on board for shipboard supplies and for money that the sailors had. The Maritime Museum used to have a great display of the sinking of HMS Tribune. They had a handful of British pennies that were recovered from the wreck of HMS Tribune. What was funny was they were counterfeit pennies. The penny that the diver happened to find was actually a fake penny that was forged in the 1700s, and that's the one that they actually found aboard the wreck. So coins are really important archaeologically because they often give you a perfect date snapshot because they have dates on them, and they often give us a glimpse at the trade and the economics behind shipping and shipwrecks. but they don't produce very good archaeology because they attract these treasure hunters. Oh, and that question, yes. I'll stick around if anybody has any one-on-one questions, but thank you very much.
And on behalf of Kathy McCarthy, our president, and all board members, we'd like to thank Dan very much for the great speech and all the history. He's got a lot of knowledge that I sure don't have, but it was a great speech. Thank you.
Okay.